cord. Yes, it's still going to be due. Make sure that you guys, I'll try to hunt down those scenes once we get done talking today and put those up. So that way you guys have got more recent links, but I've kind of put that description and kind of talked you guys through it as far as what's going on, along with updated the document. So go ahead and re-download that. Just gives a little more context to where they're at in which films, in case you guys were wondering. The other thing is whenever you're doing the formulas or you're doing those problems, you know, keep in mind everything that's going on. The easy one a lot of people are making mistakes on is the Black Panther. When he puts his hand into the ground to help the car rotate, it's not just rotating his body, but also the weight of the car, which is producing a whole lot of centripetal force. So you just got to think about the torque there. The other one to make sure that you're keeping in mind that's easy to kind of gloss over is whenever he kicks his suit and then his suit kicks him back, it's not equal forces. Just if you do the projectile motion on how far each of them go, it does not equate because the suit's not that heavy, since it's obviously able to sit inside of a necklace, as well as not only is the suit not that heavy, but the mannequin it's on is not that heavy. So yeah, the suit hits him with a differing amount of force, but I'm not going to give you the numbers there. That's part of the fun of you guys figuring that out. So any other questions?
Thank you.
You're always welcome, Colton. So let's talk about the spine, which is an interesting little thing there, as we're going to find it's got some design issues, but like anything else, it's what we got. So it's what we got to work with. Now we're talking 33 different vertebrae that we're going to divide up into 4 separate sections. And so the first 7, this is what's known as our cervical spine, the very top of which is our atlas, and that rests and holds up our skull. We have our axis, and then go down for the next 5. We then have our thoracic, and that is going to be the 12 vertebrae that span the length of all 12 of our ribs. We then have our lumbar spine, which is going to be the 5 biggest, thickest vertebrae, because those are the ones that have to support the greatest amount of weight from everything above it. And then we have the bottom, which is going to be fused, where we have 5 fused for our sacrum, and then another 4 fused for our coccyx. So that's the very bottom of your tailbone. So the sacrum is easy to think of as part of the hip, but technically it's definitely part of the spine. And each of these segments have their own natural curvature. And if we lose this curvature, we can potentially have some issues, as well as if we go ahead and have excessive amount of curvature in each of these sections. So what's useful for the spine is it allows us to have motion in all 3 planes, and is going to be that major bony protection of our spinal cord, since that's how we're sending nerve impulses to get our muscle to contract. If it becomes disconnected, now we're talking about paralysis. Depending on how high, we can be really talking about barely having any movement ability. Obviously, lower in the body, we're going to have a lot more total capacity. So the vertebral body, which is the front of the vertebrae, is where we carry most of the weight. Behind it is that neural arch, which is where we have the protective essential tunnel that the spinal cord is going to go in. And then on the backside, those facets, those are going to be our spinous and transverse processes. And these are going to be where we get a little bit of force dissipation, especially when we're in extended position, well, only when we're in extended position, but more so for that's where our muscles are going to go ahead and attach. So we're going to be able to obviously move our spine around. So if we're looking at this from the side view, we can go ahead and see how we've got a vertebral body. We've got our wonderful intervertebral disc. We've got our transverse process. And then notice, guys, we've got all of those different parts on the facets where we're going to go ahead and have muscles and, well, the tendons for them attaching. So this is just kind of only 2 vertebrae. Obviously, once again, we're stacking a lot of these, but this is the basic unit. Can I help you, Luke? We're going to get the wonderful sounds of someone opening doors and I'm guessing getting ready for breakfast. So notice when it comes to motion, we have 3 different joints. We've got the anterior side, which is the vertebral body, which is going to be separated by those discs. And this is going to form what's known as a symphysis type of amphiarthrosis joint. Luke, you doing okay there, buddy? What's cracking, man? I think Luke's got us on mute, not himself.
I'm trying to like help me get ready. I'll just go like this. Like,
it is a t-shirt still.
hmm?
It is a t-shirt though.
So.
It's not fancy enough for first thing.
Okay.
You care, apparently.
No. You should have seen me the last 2 times I went to first one when I was hungover.
And I found out how to mute Luke. I think we're all interested in knowing the rest of that story. Man, bringing the weird this morning. Are you guys doing okay? All right, so the posterior side, that's where we've got the right and left facet joints, which are going to be gliding diarthrodial joints, and they're going to be lined with what's known as articular cartilage. Okay, so we've got that intervertebral disc padding the 2 bodies on the front side, and then we've got articular cartilage on the back side when we're going and looking at those facet joints. Oh. Now, the first cervical vertebrae, which I talked about earlier, is what's known as the atlas. So think like Atlas holding up the world in Greek mythology, if I'm correct. If I'm wrong, please throw it up in the chat. I'm very interested. This is going to give us what's known as the atlas occipital joint, because that's literally your occiput. That's the bone of the skull that happens to be directly on top. Now, this only allows for a small amount of flexion extension. There's no rotation and there's no lateral movement, okay? That's all that occurs here. Now, when we go down to the next vertebrae, which is known as the axis, this is where we get a lot of motion. We get 75 degrees to rotation on either side. We're going to get lateral flexion, and we're going to also get some flexion and extension, okay? Now, as we go down the spinal column, we're going to see that our vertebrae increase in size. The anterior body gets bigger, the facets get bigger, and this is because we have to support more and more weight as we go down the line. So, any questions as of so far? Because literally, as we increase in body size, we're taking advantage of that concept that we talked about earlier, which is pressure. Because yes, the force is increasing because the atlas is holding up the skull, the axis is holding up the atlas and the skull, and so on and so forth. And so literally, your L5, your lowest lumbar vertebrae, is literally holding up all of your vertebrae and all of that tissue above, which is a lot more weight. So as the vertebral body area increases, the pressure maintains the same amount. Awesome. Thank you, Anna. Now, what we have here, guys, is a basic picture of what your average cervical vertebrae looks like compared to your average thoracic vertebrae, as opposed to your average lumbar vertebrae. So you see how we increase the size of that body. And then we're also going to be changing the angle as we go through of those facets where it's going to go ahead and be able to articulate. So their intervertebral symphysis joints are going to be on the front side, because remember, that's where we have the bodies touching. And then we have those gliding diarthrodial facet joints on the posterior. And when you're leaning forward, those two don't interact. When you're leaning back, that's when they're going to go ahead and be on top of each other, which is where we're going to see more of an effect. So what's the basic function of these facet joints? Well, A, it limits our range of motion because we can only extend the spine so far. So we're not going to be able to crush in on our wonderful spinal cord. Now, also, this is going to help with dealing with load bearing. In fact, it's going to be sustaining about 30% of that compressive load that's going on in the spine, specifically when we're in that hyperextension. So this is a potential cause of back pain because it effectively gets a little bit overwhelmed. However, it is a very useful thing when you're talking about really heavy loading. So that's why when they talk about heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, any type of heavy spinal loading, you should lift it with a neutral or an extended spine to keep yourself in a safer position. Now, the forces that we're going to find in these joints, well, we're going to have compression, and that's the forces pushing things together. We're going to have tension, which is pulling things apart. We're going to have rotation, which is twisting. And then we're going to have shear, which is going to be trying to slide one or the or across one another. Your body and your tissues are always the best with dealing with compressional forces, followed by tension forces. And then we're the worst at rotation and shear. We're hands down the worst at shear. So the facet joints themselves, they're going to give us about 80% of our ability to resist torsion. So that's that twisting, simply because they're going to be lining up on one another. And once again, we get that ability to deal with load when we're extension. And the greatest amount of force we're going to have is between the bottom of your last lumbar vertebrae and the first, well, they're all fused, but the beginning of your sacrum. And a decent amount of that low back pain, 15 to 40% is simply due to issues with the articular cartilage in those facet joints from potentially being overloaded. Especially when we're talking about the low back, and then we can be getting into what's known as lordosis. And we're going to talk about lordosis a little bit later on. So as we go further and further down, notice how the angles are going to change between those facet joints and the actual, the angle of the facet joints and the angle of which our vertebrae are going to be articulating at. Notice as we increase this angle from obviously 0 to 45 and from 45 to 90, we're going to be able to deal with greater and greater loads, okay? And notice when we get ourselves into that hyperextension, that's where we're going to have compression there. And so if you think about hyperextending your low back, you're pushing your belly forward. Now, this is something you can obviously use to keep yourself safe when you're lifting weights. However, if this is more or less due to a very large, we'll call it an American pregnancy made of mostly Bud Light and other types of beer, then that's going to be pulling you forward in such a way that turns out it makes you more likely to have issues with injury because that weight's pulling you forward. And it naturally happens to women, specifically when they're getting into that third trimester of pregnancy, if they obviously choose to have kids, because of the sheer weight of the fetus pulling the stomach forward. So inside of our wonderful lumbar spine, we have our intervertebral discs, okay? These are going to be surrounded on the outside layers by what's known as the annulus fibrosus. This is just a whole lot of cartilage rings. Now in the center, we have what's known as the nucleus pulposus. This is going to be effectively a kind of a gel, effectively, with a lot of fluid inside of it that's going to go ahead and hold its position. Now, the collagen is more sensitive to rotational strain than compression, tension, or shear. And this itself is going to work effectively like a spring that's going to hold the vertebral bodies together. Meanwhile, the nucleus pulposus, which is mostly water, definitely some collagen, and proteoglycans is literally proteins with carbohydrates bonded to them that actually keeps water in the area. And this is going to allow it to deal with a greater amount of compression. So you think of it almost as like kind of a ball bearing in the center. So if you're going to think about it, annulus fibrosus, that's that spring. And then the pulpus is going to be effectively like a ball bearing in the center. Now, whenever we happen to be going in flexion and extension, we're literally rolling over that nucleus. And as we go throughout the day, the most normal form of force to deal with is compression. So me standing here, going and teaching, that is naturally going through compression. My cervical spine is supporting my head, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. The only time when we're not compressing it is effectively when we're laying down, or if you're doing something that's giving you natural traction of force, like doing pull-ups, hanging leg raises, anything where effectively we're decompressing the spine. So what we're going to find is flexion extension are all putting compressive stress on the disc on one side and then tensile on the other. So if we think of them being right on top of each other, as I lean to a side, notice I have tension on the side with my thumbs, but I'm compressing the side with my pinkies. And so rotation, that's going to go ahead and create that general shear stress. So through the nature of the beast of living, when you extend your back, you're creating tension on the anterior side and you're putting compression on the posterior side. And obviously too much under too great of a load, especially like magnitude of loading, like you drop a weight on yourself or otherwise, that's where we can really run the risk of potential disc herniations. We'll get into those later. Now, shear force is going to be, once again, that rotational component. So when we're turning, which is an absolutely fine and normal movement to find in sports and activities. The key is, like anything else, you just don't necessarily want to do it with crazy amounts of load. We want to make sure that we're doing it with an appropriate load given what our tissues are essentially adapted to, because you do have a certain amount of adaptability in all your tissues. Now, over the day, literally thanks to that compression, you're losing a certain amount of that fluid. In fact, your average person is going to lose about 2 centimeters, or think about almost 3/4 of an inch of height in a day, just due to the nature of the beast of that fluid leaking out of there. Now, when we go ahead and lay down, we're going to go and reabsorb the water. It's going to go ahead and allow us to go back to what would be effectively our maximal height. Now, this is something to keep in mind because it has effectively 2 major functions here. One, the longer you've been on your feet, the more likely your back could be giving you trouble by the end of the day simply because you've got so much compressive force. The second being, when you first get up in the morning, your body is almost hyperhydrated in your spinal column, and hence why there's a slightly increased risk of back injuries from heavy resistance training and otherwise if you lift weights first thing in the morning, like roll out of bed and immediately hop under heavy bars. So, like anything else, as we decrease that fluid amount over day, then all of a sudden we're going to go ahead and find ourselves with a lot more stiffness, okay? So hence, if we lay down, like I said, get up immediately and go, this can be an issue. People that literally experience effectively no gravity, they're going to actually grow about 2 inches in height. And like anything else, depending on what you're doing is going to give us that information on how fast you happen to be shrinking. So anything that involves that spinal loading, hence walking, is going to have a greater amount than standing, which is greater than sitting. And cycling when you're leaning forward, well, now we don't have that weight going through our body. Lying down is an easy way to go and increase it because we don't have that force going through. Now, what's fascinating is actually blood flow. And we're going to find the same thing with all the tendons in our body, is after a relatively young age, you no longer have direct blood flow to those areas. So the only way that you are going to be able to get nutrients to those cells that make up your intervertebral discs is literally through movement. And this is an issue because if we never move around, we're never going to go ahead and get that nutrient turnover to those tissues. They're not going to repair themselves, and you're going to have issues with perhaps degeneration. And this is obviously a major catch-22 because if you hurt your back, how much do you guys really want to move your back after that? If you hurt your back, how much do you really want to move your back after you do that? Bingo. And then, of course, we're not delivering nutrients to those areas. So now we're going to have even harder of a time getting those tissues to recover because we're not delivering any nutrients to those areas. So hence why back pain is such a pain to go ahead and deal with. Now, as we get older, we're not going to be able to reabsorb as much water. So we're not going to be able to deal with as much shock, potentially going to have the greatest amount of degeneration on the L5-S1 simply because it's the base of the spine. It deals with the greatest forces. And like anything else, the fluid content is going to go ahead and diminish. You guys haven't noticed, old folks tend to go ahead and be shorter. And as we go ahead and go through this, now we're going to have to make those facets take on more of the force because they're now compressed even further. And like anything else, we can not just have a reduction in height, but then changes in our spinal column. This is where you can see folks that are frozen in kind of bent over positions because they're not able to move anymore thanks to essentially the degeneration of their spinal column, potentially some issues with loading over their lifespan, and definitely some potential issues with activity choices. So we can see that loss of lumbar curve, so they're gonna be really flat backed in the low body. And what's interesting is great amounts of vibration and smoking also can have negative effects on your disc health, whereas exercise is a mean to improve it. Now, let's talk about those curves of the spine, okay? The thoracic and sacral curves are all going to be a little bit forward. And this is present at birth because that's part of how in the final trimester, effectively, your body was effectively facing when you were inside of your mother's womb. Now it's once we're born, that's when we're going to start to develop our cervical and our lumbar curves, because literally now we have to hold our head up along with we're going to be arching through our spine. And like anything else, this is going to change as we develop as humans. Now, it's normal to have a little bit of a lordic curve in the lumbar and the cervical spine, and then a forward turn a little bit through your thoracic and your pelvis. We do not want it to be exaggerated. So lordosis, like I talked about earlier, in people that are really overweight and or, different group, and pregnant women, is going to be a potential cause of back pain because we're overloading those facets all day long. Kyphosis, when we're bent forward like that, can just kind of lead itself more to kind of breathing issues over a long enough period of time. And I'm sure all of you guys have met somebody with scoliosis where their back is twisted, and that's going to be kind of, unfortunately, something that happens more developmentally. It can sometimes have to be effectively fixed through surgery, just because that asymmetry can can lead to later issues. Now, when it comes to posture, which everybody naturally can have some issues with it, bringing awareness to it is sometimes a way that you can find a solution. Giving folks cues as far as, keep your head up, make sure that you're trying to keep your head back. We're not trying to look forward on everything as everywhere we go, but just trying to be in a good neutral position can be useful. But definitely things to re-cue as far as exercises, because like anything else, right now, how many of you guys are probably hunched over your computer because you're just staring at your screen trying to get through this lecture of somebody you don't really like listening to? How many of you guys are kind of just flopped over on the couch or otherwise with a little bit more rounding in your spine than you should? So like anything else, we want to build balance with the musculature and use the muscles move your bones. So your bones are slaves to your muscles. If we have the right amount of muscular development in the muscles we need, it's going to pull us into a better alignment. So we're going to be able to go ahead and keep that upright posture of where we want to be. If instead we hang out on our ligaments, then we're just going to be hunched over wherever we go because our body is used to not actually holding itself up, and it's letting, once again, those ligaments hold us in position. So for someone that's kyphotic, this is where we're talking about keeping the shoulders back, keep our head up, and like anything else, stretching the front side of the body. So that way we're not going to be pulling ourselves forward into D-bag bro lifter position 1, and strengthening our scapular retractors, so the muscles on the back side of the body, so we're going to be able to keep ourselves in a good postural position. Now for lordosis, now we're talking about trying to get your tailbone to the floor, trying to keep yourself more upright, stretch those hip flexors and potentially your low back, so you're not going to be being pulled forward all day long, along with strengthening your abs to keep you in a better neutral position. So the nice thing is, thanks to having our spine the way it is, we can effectively move in every single plane. The key is, if we're under a heavy load, we do not want the spine to move. We want it to keep it in neutral, if not in extension. So extension is mostly neutral. Hyperextension is really going for it. That's probably where we want to live with heavy loading. However, if we're talking about throwing a baseball, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to rotate along with have lateral flexion and flexion in general. And we're going to start an extension and hyperextension. So there's nothing wrong with that. Key is like anything else, it's the magnitude of the forces that are going to get you. Now, we then have the muscles of the head, of the neck, of the upper back, and of the low back when it comes to moving the head. There is a lot of them, guys. There's a lot of them. okay? So the picture on the left is going to be of the posterior view. The picture on the right is going to be of the interior view. So literally when we talk about trying to go ahead and flex the head, okay? Now we're talking about, or sorry, both of these are actually anterior view because you notice the resection of the jaw. If we see capitus, okay, that is going to be talking about the skull, okay? If you hear rectus, that's just kind of a long straight, anterior meaning front side. Now, longus is simply going to tell you that the muscle happens to be long. So all of those together are going to be what's going to pull our head forward. And notice when we're looking at these muscles, there's always pulling in angles. And that's why when it comes to training the neck, we're going to be going in a number of different directions. Now, the hyoid is going to be your Adam's apple, okay? And so there's 8 different pairs of muscles that are going to pull your neck forward pull your chin forward with whatever type of flexional force you're having to overcome. Now, when it comes to extensors, we have our splenius capitis, we have our splenius cervicus, which is deeper, and that's more just for the cervical spine. And then we have got our much smaller muscles that are going into both our atlas and axis that are going to go ahead and not just pull the head back, but pull it laterally and also help it rotate, okay? You're gonna have to take some time going through these. Then we've got our rib cage, which has our intercostals, and that's mostly used for breathing. We're not using those to get anterior movement. It's more or less kind of a brick through here. So we go then to our lumbar spine. So we have our rectus abdominis, or our abs, how most people think of it. We then have our exterior and our interior obliques. Now, our external obliques are going to pennate forward. Our internal obliques are going to pennate backwards. And that's why when I want to turn to my right, I use my external oblique on my left side and my internal oblique on my right side to twist throughout my core. We also have what's known as the transverse abdominis, which is kind of your body's own natural weight belt. Underneath, that's also going to go, it's what, whenever I say suck it in, that's the actual muscle that you happen to be firing at that moment in time. Now, we then have our thoracic and lumbar spinal extensors. So that's what's allowing us to extend that spine. Now, collectively, you typically refer to them as the erector spinae, but notice they're made up of our spinalis, longissimus, and iliocostalis when we're talking about the lower back. We've got our semispinalis, and then our deep spinal muscles, which if we look over on the far right, that's when we're talking about our multifidi, rotaries, interspinales, intertransversari, and levators costarum. And all of these little muscles added together are going to be what's allowing us to extend that back, but also when we fire one side more than the other, which is going to allow us to go ahead and rotate. Speaking of which, when we talk about lateral movement in the neck, now we've got our SCM, and that's usually the big one that you can see on a lot of folks. Then you've got your levator scapulae, which is helping a little bit with lateral movement, but also lifting your scapula, which kind of becomes problematic depending on what you have to do with certain movements. And then we've got our scalenes, which are going to be deep into those first ribs and otherwise. And those can be other things that are pretty uncomfortable if you happen to strain them. But notice, guys, we're pulling everything in oblique angles. We're not really going straight forward and straight back. If we want to go straight forward, we have to fire on both sides at the same time, and then same thing. So in order to move and articulate our neck, we have to fire a lot of individual muscles in different patterns, as opposed to if you want to flex your arm, you fire your bicep. You want to extend your arm, you fire your tricep. It's straightforward on how you're pulling against those. So neck training is interesting because it has to be naturally a bit more dynamic because, once again, we're using very different patterns and we have got so many wildly different options for patterns. Now, when it comes to lateral flexors of your spine, you've got your quadratus lumborum. This is something that can easily lock up in people's low back. It is something that I've had to battle with a number of times in the past, and it is super uncomfortable when you happen to get it nice and pissed off at you. You then have your psoas major, which is going to be what's allowing you to go ahead and work to not just lift your leg up, but also to allow for some lateral movement. And especially if this is tight, so hip flexor, it's going to naturally pull you more into that lumbar extension or that lordotic posture. So that's why stretching your hip flexors is typically a very good thing to do if you're having issues with low back health. So let's talk about the joys of loads on the spine. We've got our body weight, we've got our tension in the ligaments and the muscles, and then any external loads carried in your hands, carried on your back, carried on your head. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is everything that my spine is holding up. Well, it turns out the center of gravity of your spine is in front of where, your center of gravity of your spine is in front of where your actual spine is. So everything on the posterior pretty much always has to fire. Otherwise, you're going to naturally collapse forward because you naturally have a loading that's anterior. So no matter what, we're having to have to contract. And once we get down to the very bottom of the spine, because we're getting into that sacrum, we're typically going to have a bit more shear force going on with our L5S1 because of it's not sitting right on top of each other. Instead, it's sitting in an angle. So this is where that force vectoring is important to understand again. So as we get to be in a flatter position, we're increasing the amount of shear and decreasing the amount of compression that our spine has to be going through. This is not necessarily a bad thing because, like anything else, we can also get ourselves into a position where our spine is undergoing tension, and or we can just go ahead and focus on stabilizing against a lighter load and avoiding the shearing force. Then we have to worry about using compression of much heavier loads in order to have the same effect. So as we're going to go ahead and load and we're having that compression, it's important to understand those wonders of the center of gravity of each of those parts of the body and how each of those has to be distributed through the spine. So you guys can see that good old lever arm. Notice it's going to be the actual distance of the effort arm for each of these segments. And so when looking at this, what's the thing that this person could do to easily decrease the amount of shearing force that we happen to have going on through the lumbar spine with that, with the way that they're kind of standing with that box? What could they do to make this much easier on their body? Okay, so Anna's point of instead of being bent over, we now straighten up. Absolutely. Now we've shortened all those lever arms. And instead of holding the box in front of us, hold the box super close to us. Absolutely. Marlana, in certain positions, you can't really use your legs more. You're kind of stuck in otherwise, but that could be a natural, another way of saying the same thing that Anna put out there. So, you know, all of those are potential solutions. So the big key is, especially when you're doing heavy loading, is you keep that weight nice and close to your body, trying to be about as upright as you can be. Now, you're not made of glass. You're not going to bend over once and then you blow your spine out through your butt. Instead, it's going to be making poor decisions chronically over a long period of time, and then also not moving, not do things with appropriate posture. That's when we're going to run ourselves into major orthopedic issues. So don't think that you guys are that fragile and that you're not able to deal with any of these forces. Instead, think of it along the lines of your body only wants to tolerate so much. So we got to be smart about how much of this we happen to be making the body tolerate. There's literally a bird trying to get in through the window. I thought I'd do this lecture from the old classroom to feel like things were normal again. And then I realized not so much. And then I also just realized I've been wearing my mask this entire time. So remember again, guys, as we extend the spine, we're going to be creating tension on the anterior and compression on the posterior. So too much of this, obviously, on one side or the other, that's where we can really risk ourselves getting into issues. Now, as we extend, that's where we're going to get that force being tolerated by the facets. Remember, it's going to be able to support up to about 30% of it. And as we go through into different postures, notice the increase in the loading through, and notice, guys, this is L3, so the lumbar vertebrae number 3. So standing is actually less than sitting, which is less than standing bent forward, which is less than standing or sitting hunched. So hence why standing is such a healthy decision for you to do. Also known as I just didn't want to be sitting in my office, so yay. So remember, we can do all movements in the spine and not really have to worry about getting ourselves jacked up as long as we're being intelligent and doing things with effectively as good of posture as possible. Now, we want to make sure that when we're going into hyperextension, yeah, we've got that hip flexor flexibility, and we want to go ahead and make sure that we've got really good thoracic extension. This is especially important when it comes to doing things like overhead movements. You want a great example of this? There you go. Because notice this individual's got great hip flexor mobility and they've got good thoracic mobility because they can easily hit and hold this back bend. Now, when it comes to that rotational and shearing force on the discs, that's going to happen when we happen to be rotating. So, like anything else, we want to be doing this rotation in a neutral position. We don't want to be hunched over. We don't want to be hyperextended. We want to be somewhere in the middle, and that's more than okay. However, like anything else, the loading, if we happen to go too high, can be problematic. I enjoy this picture because it's like an awesome version of like the late thousands, because notice he's got the sweet tribal tattoo. And of course, you know, you have to lift weights in the undershirt because otherwise no one will know how swole you are. Now, here is what's kind of interesting when we're doing a true flexion movement. Now, this is going to be fine. Now, if we're going to be twisting in this position, it could be a bit of a problem. Now, notice by using the ball, we've increased that resistance arm. Now, what's a way that we could hold that ball that would make it so it didn't actually give us much of an overload, so it really wasn't that difficult to lift?
Close to your body.
Yes, and not just close to your body, but lower on your torso. So we've shortened that lever arm. It's easier to curl up against it. What can you do to make it a lot harder?
Hold it further from away from your torso and away from your body and over your head.
Bingo, bingo. Try to hold that ball overhead. If you do that the entire time, that's going to massively increase the lever arm, which can make something a lot heavier. So I used to get a kick out of people doing like the incline sit-ups, and they'd be holding like the 45-pound weight on their stomach. They're like, I'm so strong. And then I was like, just try to hold that thing at eye level. And you just see them just get stapled going down. And it's like, oh yeah, maybe you should start off with a lighter weight going through and using that fuller range of motion, and then worry about advancing from there, as opposed to let's ego up and put a really heavy dumbbell on our stomach because reasons. Now, like anything else, I love this picture because they're both downright stupid because they don't work. If you're bent over like this, notice guys, their center of mass is literally going to be probably in front of their body, especially if that box weighs more than 2 ounces. They're going to fall on their face. And then same thing here, the way that this person is squatting down, if this box has any real weight, again, it's quite possibly going to put them off balance. The key is whenever you're lifting anything, just make sure we're lifting it with good posture. You can bend over with good posture. In fact, that's the basics of using what's known as a Romanian deadlift, and then the harder variation and orthopedically harder on your body of a straight leg deadlift, or even doing good mornings. Absolutely fine, safe movements to utilize when appropriately programmed and progressed. However, if you're doing that with a rounded posture, now we're talking about an increasing risk of injury. Now we're talking about potentially hurting ourselves. So yes, try to do everything with as good a posture as you can. And then like anything else, if you're just trying to lift heavier weights, which is fun, it's something I enjoy doing, make sure we're really focusing on trying to do everything with great posture. And when our posture breaks down, that's the end of the set. And that's what's giving you the difference between what's known as technical failure, where your technique is broken down, and true failure, where you're just not able to lift the weight anymore. Now, that transverse abdominis, where that is that lifting belt we have inside. So when we contract it, it's going to naturally help us stay upright. We're also going to use what's known as the Valsalva maneuver, which is going to be bearing down under a held breath as a means to increasing that intrathoracic pressure, which is going to also help keep us upright. And then, of course, we can always use a lifting belt as another way to help improve this. Now, when it comes to back injuries, most of them are going to be in the lumbar region. So we're talking about obviously the low back. Sometimes they'll be in the thoracic, small amount of the cervical, and then small amount, they just don't even have the numbers because people report things not always correctly. So yes, low back pain is sometimes a hard thing to find, because it shows itself in a lot of different ways. In fact, one of the more terrifying things that I found is that if you actually have people go through and get scans of their low backs, a certain amount of people will have disc herniations, but they'll present with no pain. A certain amount of people will have no disc herniations. Optically, everything looks perfect, but they'll be presenting with pain. And then some folks who have herniations obviously are presenting with pain. Now, if you tell the folks that have herniations that don't have pain about their herniations, then they start presenting with pain. So there's a lot of psychology and physiology going on there, which makes it pretty rough. You got soft tissues injuries. I'm sure you guys have all fallen on your back, taken a hit in the back or otherwise and had some issues. You can obviously have both acute fracturing of different parts of the spine along with stress fractures, which is relatively rare, but if you have low bone mineral density and a lot of impacts, disc herniations, which here's the other terrifying fact, disc herniation, whether you get surgery on it, whether you have PT, chiropractic, or you do nothing, after 1 year, all 4 of those populations have about the same quality of recovery, same quality of life. So just because you got a herniated disc doesn't mean you need to go immediately under the knife. Instead, it's important to, find whatever modality is going to work for you, but understanding that doing nothing tends to make just as much progress. And then whiplash, when you guys, unfortunately, car accidents are the most likely place that you guys are going to get a concussion and obviously potentially whiplash, where your head is just going to snap forward really fast, overstretching and putting a lot of strain on all those muscles through the neck, which in turn is going to obviously have some major issues and take a little while to recover from. So picture that stress fracture. So we're talking back on the facet parts, which obviously if we keep loading and loading and loading, we can turn that into a true fracture, but either way, it's going to be pretty uncomfortable. Now, osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture literally means because our bone mineral density is so low, we're literally starting to crush the forms of our vertebrae and we're going to be stuck in those positions. So that was when I talked about some older folks when literally their posture has been so bad for so long, they're literally stuck in position. You then have what's known as spondylolisthesis, and this is going to be where one bone of the vertebrae is able to slip out of its position onto one below it. I have thankfully never experienced this, but it is obviously super painful because literally now we've had things slip out of its facet joint and move far further than it should. And yes, if it's in the lumbar spine, thankfully due to the cauda equina, now we're into nerves, so you just might have some neuropathy, but you're not risking tearing your spinal cord. But at the same time, you're going to have a bad day. Now, spondylolysis is going to be that stress fracture also on the outrigging of those facets. And this is going to be something that's typically due to just kind of a defect, which is going to in turn lead itself potentially to stress fractures, which eventually can literally break enough that we get that spondylolisthesis. So spondylolysis is something that is a relatively normal cause. And then sadly enough, we have the wonders of disc herniation, which is thanks to enough trauma. Now this can be due to once again, something heavy being dropped on you, or obviously a collision, some type of injury, or other types of, causes, the horrible combination of a relatively sedentary lifestyle and then something acutely traumatically happening, which in turn is going to cause part of that nucleus pulposus to bulge out. And it's also damaging those collagenous rings. And remember, the only way to get tissue in here to regenerate is to move. And you don't really want to move if you just herniated your disc. Now, what can then happen is most of these tears happen to occur typically to the posterior. And this in turn is going to cause pressure to be on your nerves coming off your spinal cord. Now that pressure in turn itself can cause burning sensation in the limbs, numbness, tingling, and obviously just sensation of pain or a lack of ability to contract. So like anything else, you need to be very, very careful if anything like this happens and giving yourself a long period of time to allow yourself to recover. So, end of slides. So we covered the back, what's going on with each different segment, the normal curvatures, the muscles that are allowing us to move and keep our posture appropriately in these regions, along with kind of the basics of how we keep it safe, and then some potential negative health outcomes that can occur. And unfortunately, life just kind of comes at you hard sometimes. Now, we still got plenty of time today. So that means it's time for you guys to go ahead and work with each other again. So let's have some fun today. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move the chat so it's not on my second screen, so it makes it easier for me to see these things. I want you guys to go ahead and give me everybody that happens to be in, go ahead and let me know who's in what group, guys. Look at you, Dakota, way to be on the, way to be on it. Okay. And Lexi, I'm going to go ahead and throw you in with the, make sure I got that group correct. Put you in with the free throw group again. Okay, so now, don't hop in the groups yet. I'm just want to make sure I got those all set. Okay. You guys are going to have your movement where actually, let's do this. Okay. So say for the baseball group, we know we have essentially a preparation phase. We're then going to go ahead and have that wind up. So we're back here. We're going to have the force producing, and then we're going to have the follow through. Okay. In theory, you've got the degrees of how much you moved in each of those phases. So now what I want you guys to do with that information is let's figure out what would have been the torque at those joints. We're not worrying about the actual individual muscles yet, but remember, we're going to be going and using those wonderful inertial formulas, which is, actually, let's go back and use the whiteboard after all, because torque times the time of that phase is going to equal our final angular momentum compared to our initial angular momentum. Sorry, something's putting something up in the chat. Let's see what's going here. Thank you, Anna, and also thank you, Axel. The homework for chapter 4, I don't know what happened there, guys. A lot of you guys emailed me like, hey, I think I have the right answer. And I was like, yeah, you do have the right answer. It's been miscoding them for some reason. So don't freak out if you don't have the grade that you need to. I'm gonna have to go through manually and look at each of your quizzes and make sure that you guys get the points back you deserve. It's gonna take me a little time. But thank you guys for following up and asking good questions, because unfortunately Blackboard stuff gets a little wonky sometimes, and we're all trying to get through this stuff together. So back to the formula then. So that means our just gonna be torque times time equals, and then remember our angular momentum is going to be equal to our mass times our radius squared times our angular velocity. And in a perfect world, guys, you guys are going to do this in what's known as radians, and 1 radian equals 180 degrees. So you guys can do the math there if you want to, and just do that over on that side of trig. But for now, I'm just happy if you guys are showing the correct logic. Radius times r squared times the initial angular velocity. So help each other out, go through your joints, and remember the radius, that's going to be the length of that limb. And now the radius might change as you go through, which is going to be a pain in the butt. So then you've got your initial radius. So like say that throw, I got my arm in tight, but then as I finish through, I have my arm in more extended. So my radius is extended. The mass stayed the same between the weight of the ball, the weight of my forearm, the weight of my upper arm. And then obviously the angular rotation has changed. So I might have had a negative because I came back, and now I have a positive as I go forward. It's not meant to be easy, guys. It's 10:25. I don't plan on bringing you guys all back together until 10:40. We're going to kind of wrap up a little bit together. Otherwise, work on this in your groups. Make sure you guys talk through it. And if you guys need help, don't be afraid to ask, and I will hop in the room with you guys and try to help where I can. Questions, comments, concerns, but before we send you guys over into your breakout rooms. All right, guys. Breakout rooms are open. When you're ready, go ahead and get after it. Oh, Luke finally gave me his. Give me 1 second, bud. I need to reassign you. All right, go for it. I appreciate you guys being patient. Obviously, you guys are still working through and realizing it's a lot. It's a lot. And one thing to keep in mind that we were talking about with effectively a couple of the groups is you're going to have, when we have our initial angular momentum and our final angular momentum, the speed it was going, that's relatively easy to find out. The radius and mass is weird because you need to do the radius and mass for each individual segment. So for the upper arm, the forearm, and the hand, if we're doing something with the shoulder. And the other thing is that center of mass distance might be shorter initially and longer at the end. So we have to also add that in because that's the greater amount of torque the shoulder has to come up with in order to go and move through those phases. It's a lot. You've got to think your way through it. You've got to, kind of use your mind's eye to picture it, draw it out, watch the videos of it. And obviously we're just doing our best to ballpark that center of mass distance from the actual joint, because that's what's giving us information as far as the torque. So I'm sorry for running over. I will see you guys on Tuesday of next week, and we're going to keep getting after it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know. And otherwise, have a great day, guys. Bye-bye. Okay. Jordan, what do you mean by that? Jordan, can you give me some more context? Because I don't. Yes, that's why I've talked through multiple times and also given you guys examples on where you can find those as far as what you're searching for, and you should be able to find them. I will work on trying to actually get the true updates on those the sooner we get done with those. Possibly do lab 3 without a force plate. The preferred is to use the force plates. You're going to find those videos on the 2020 biomechanics lectures, and you'll see the lab examples there, so you can just copy the data through there. So you can look at the more recent iteration of the superhero homework, and it will go ahead and have effectively a little bit more information as to what each of those scenes and what movies it's from. And like I said, I'm working on it. Does that explain things, Jordan? Okay, So stay safe out there, guys. See you guys later. Bye-bye.